The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Standards of Evidence and Flying Deer. Hey, I hope you're all doing well. I'm getting ready to head to the American Atheist Convention this coming Easter weekend in Cincinnati, Ohio, which will date this video, but it'll live on anyway. This will be the third time in the last month that I've addressed issues of standards of evidence. Shortly after a debate on the resurrection, I did a video, Am I Too Skeptical? And then a couple of weeks later, after another debate on the resurrection, I did a video which I just posted that addressed standards of evidence with a lottery ticket example. I was listening to public radio the other day while I was driving around, and I heard a story that I think may be useful. This is not going to necessarily be, it doesn't have anything to do with religion. It's not going to be anything that gives you insight into debating religious topics. But it is an incredibly amusing and enlightening anecdote that I hope will be useful to people when you start talking about standards of evidence. And the reason I wanted to go ahead and add this video in, even though we talked about standards of evidence quite a lot lately, is because I don't think you can talk about it too much. I'll be getting back to other subjects in the Bible and debates in next month. But we need stories like this, and we need ways to talk about standards of evidence that can serve as good analogies to lead people to understand where they may have flaws in their epistemology, where they may have opportunities to improve. And the more examples we have of this that stick in people's minds, I think the better off we're going to be when we try to address them. Because if you're having a discussion, a debate about the resurrection, and everything you talk about is just about the resurrection, you can often miss opportunities to teach an underlying principle because you're focused on the facts. Well, what did Paul say? Well, what did Saul, what happened here? Do we have good accounts of this? And well, Bart Ehrman says, and this happened in the previous debate where he's citing people left and right, and I pointed out the hypocrisy of citing Bart Ehrman as a source for the historicity of some of the claims when he doesn't accept the conclusion that is reached. It's not too far removed from when William Lane Craig gets up and tries to cite the Borguth-Vilenkin model, and then we have video of Alan Guth basically saying, yeah, Craig doesn't understand my model, probably because he's not a physicist. But here's an example which I listened to in great detail. And if you can find the clip, I think it was on PRX radio, which I'm assuming is public radio of some kind. I have Sirius satellite radio in the car and was listening to this just the other day. So you might be able to contact them. It was a story about a woman who worked at the Smithsonian cataloging birds and building this incredible library of knowledge of bird specimens and categorizing them and teaching people for years. She was a tireless worker and a national treasure who, after listening to this story and everything she did, I would be in favor of giving Roxy a statue right there at the Smithsonian, because this sort of stuff is incredibly impressive. Because early on it begins with, hey, we're just studying nature and we're trying to learn as much about nature as we can. And nobody anticipated at the time that we began cataloging all these birds at the Smithsonian that there would be a use for this other than looking at nature and learning about nature and maybe discovering things about evolution and the heritage of different birds. But it turns out this became a really practical use a little later on, because planes hit birds. And so the research that they'd done on birds, their characteristics, their habitat, their interaction with other flying things, served to allow plane manufacturers to have a better understanding of how they needed to design their planes. What size of bird is going to go through a jet turbine and not actually do damage to the turbine, even if it will kill the bird. And this led to other things, the story that I'm going to relay right now. And I won't tell it anywhere near as good as they did on PRX because I'm highlighting a slightly different aspect. So go back and listen to it if you can. There was a pilot who, while he was flying, hit something. And it did massive damage to the plane. And after he landed, they went out and they checked the structure and they found the blood and goop of whatever living thing he had actually hit. And in order to file an insurance claim, he needed to show, yeah, I hit a bird while I was flying around and not, I rammed it into a tree or whatever, because that's a different type of insurance claim. And so the Smithsonian got the tissue, and this happened after DNA analysis was available. Earlier, it would have just been studying whatever we could find about the feathers to specifically see if there were patterns, or look at the barbs and try to determine what sort of bird that it hit. But there was actually blood evidence, and DNA testing was available. So they sent out the blood evidence, and it came back as white-tailed deer. And, as relayed in the story, the question was, are you sure you actually were flying and hit something and weren't, like taxiing down a road and nailed a deer? And the guy's like, no, I was absolutely flying, and you can, check the flight logs and the altimeter, whatever else. So they sent the results off again, and once again, it came back as white-tailed deer. Now, DNA evidence is really reliable, but it's not foolproof. There's problems with collection methods. There are problems with samples. I'm not remotely an expert, but while it's probably one of the more conclusive methods we have of tying a blood sample to some other living thing or category of living thing, it's not without problems. If we had stopped right there in the investigation, well, it would seem that people could make an argument for flying deer. Maybe this is a relative of the white-tailed deer that is some sort of flying reindeer, and maybe this is the source story for the Santa Claus origin story. Who knows? And if we hadn't done our due diligence, you would have at least, hopefully, an anomalous record out there of a plane hitting something in the air with blood information that came back as white-tailed deer. But when we find something that's an anomaly, when we find something that does not fit with our understanding of the universe, we have to do our due diligence and investigate further, or set it aside as an anomaly and reach no conclusion. During the recent debate, I kind of gave a heuristic model of the types of things that go through our brain when we're presented with a new claim. The first one is, do I already believe this claim? And by the way, if I already do believe this claim, that doesn't mean that it's no longer worth questioning. It just means that what I'm being presented is consistent with what I already accept. And I don't accept that white-tailed deer can fly. Then you have to ask other questions. What is the supporting evidence for this? What do I know about the person who's making the claim? Do they have some motivation to lie? If I were to accept this claim, how does that change my understanding of reality? If I accept this claim as fact, does that mean I have to think that white-tailed deer fly? Is there another plausible explanation? Maybe he was flying down a ravine and a white-tailed deer jumped off the cliff and then hit the plane, which would also be extraordinary, but it's not outside the realm of plausibility. You have to ask yourself a whole bunch of questions. Our brains do this almost automatically. We don't actually sit there and go, okay, what do I know about the person who's asking this, and then catalog it. You just can't operate on that level, or you would never be able to make decisions about anything. But the key thing is, if there's something that's anomalous, we need to highlight that and say either we need to investigate this more now, or we can't investigate it more now, so we need to leave it labeled as an anomaly in case something in the future comes up that matches that. Now we have a new starting point. Or maybe in the future, we'll be able to investigate it further. As it happens, despite the DNA testing, the people at the Smithsonian were not convinced that white-tailed deer could fly or that the white-tailed deer was responsible for this. So they went through the tissue samples and they found a tiny little portion of a feather, which, because of all the work that Roxy and others had done at the Smithsonian, allowed them to identify the bird in question. And the bird in question was, you're right, it was a vulture. And now all of a sudden you have a reasonable story that there was a vulture who was feasting on a dead deer, who flew up and hit a plane. And now nothing about that is particularly extraordinary and certainly doesn't exceed the evidence. We have the blood evidence for the deer, we have the feather evidence for the bird, we have a story that fits in with our understanding of reality. Have we discovered the truth? No. Because science doesn't make proclamations about truth. What we've done is we've created a reliable account that is consistent with the available evidence, that is not appealing to anything outside of the known. Hey, vultures eat deer, vultures fly, vultures hit planes. It just happened to be that this particular vulture, when it hit the plane, left more of the deer carcass and blood on the plane than its own body. And because of that, you now have a plausible explanation. Nobody's making a declaration that it's absolute truth, and you can file it with your insurance claim. This is why we have good standards of evidence, because we shouldn't be paying out insurance claims that are fraudulent. We also shouldn't be denying insurance claims that aren't fraudulent. And when the preponderance of evidence is such that we have a story where the evidence makes sense and the narrative makes sense and the evidence all fits together to say, yes, this is the most plausible account, and it matches consistently with what the pilot's saying, that he was actually flying and hit what he thought was a bird, but we needed to find out. Where we establish our standards of evidence isn't just arbitrary, and it's not just, oh, well, I want more evidence from this. It's not a personal, subjective thing in a broad sense. Yes, you get to decide what you find convincing, but what you find convincing is independent from what we can establish as reasonable standards of evidence, which is why when you're on trial in a courtroom in the United States, there are a number of different standards of evidence that apply based on the type of crime. If it is a significant crime, then you might have to demonstrate that the individual is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that you've got this mountain of evidence such that anybody who's expressing doubts now is unreasonable, even if we haven't completely thoroughly defined what unreasonable is. So there's beyond a reasonable doubt. Then there's also to a reasonable certainty, that we are strongly confident of this. There's to a preponderance of the evidence. And these are graduated standards by which we establish what is reasonable to accept for this particular claim. Which is why when we talk about the problems in the world, where somebody makes a claim against another person, and they want to say, oh, believe the victim. Well, I would point out that we have an accusation, and here's someone who is claiming that they're a victim, and that what we should do is not disbelieve them. We should investigate and find out as much evidence as we can so that we reach the most reasonable conclusion. Claiming that people are just rampantly running around lying isn't necessarily consistent with the data, and neither is claiming that nobody lies. David Hume, in one of many axioms from Hume that I really like, when presented with a claim, I have to ask myself, is it more likely that this person is deceived or is attempting to deceive than that the event actually occurred? And his axiom, of course, is to reject the greater miracle, which, as I pointed out in the recent debate and other times, does not mean that you accept the lesser miracle. Because there could be several candidate explanations, and we want to reject the greater miracles. And then whatever's left, we want to have a sufficient evidence that it's the right answer before we say it's the right answer, before we say, I'm convinced this is most likely the right answer. And it applies globally. It applies to claims about religion. It applies to claims about hitting a bird in the air. It applies to claims about sexual assault. It applies to claims about lottery tickets. This is the foundation of skepticism and critical thinking. No one, I was asked during the debate, who made you the arbiter of what is sound epistemology? And I was like, I never claimed that I was, in fact, the arbiter of what is sound epistemology. What I should have said is, I just demonstrated that my epistemology is more sound than my opponent's. And what I did say was that I should be the arbiter of what is sound epistemology. And that was a joke, but it was a joke playing on the fact that I have higher standards of evidence and a good understanding of why it needs to be that way. You can agree or disagree. But if you want to claim that you have a better standard of evidence, here's the thing you've got to recognize. You should be able to demonstrate how and why you think it's a better standard. And it's really easy to do. It's a better standard if it prevents me from being fooled in these scenarios, and it gets me to actual reasonable conclusions in these other scenarios. Simply having a standard of evidence that's so high that you believe nothing accomplishes nothing. And having a standard of evidence so low that you believe everything also accomplishes nothing. What we need is that balance so that we are able to discern what is most probably true when we can. And that has to be measured by one other key thing: the willingness to say that the answer is, right now, I don't know. We need to get better at making people more comfortable acknowledging that they don't know. And then if there's something that they don't know that we think they should know, giving them the tools to let them go out and discover this. It's not just that, oh, we're all uncomfortable saying I don't know. We are. But if it's the right answer, then that should be the only answer that we're comfortable with. See you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.